Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie Affinito, KidLit Loving host, inviting you back for another bookish conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I'm talking with Erin Becker about her debut middle grade novel, Crushing It. In it, readers join Mel and Tory as they navigate their way through the soccer championships, now that their friend group has fallen apart. When they connect anonymously online, their lives become increasingly complex as their feelings deepen and they realize there may be more than hate there. We've got a lot to talk about with this book, and I cannot wait to get started. So let's get right to it. Erin, welcome to KidLit Love. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie. And that was a really good summary. I feel like I should have been taking notes because sometimes after you write a book, you realize you're gonna have to pitch it in one or two words or one or two sentences, and it's not always simple. So really appreciated that look at the plot.
Well, thank you, and you're welcome. So we have a lot that I cannot wait to dive into with this book. I loved Crushing It. There are so many layers, so many questions I have for you about the book that I know listeners are going to be interested in too. But before we get there, I would love to turn the spotlight on you. Since you are a debut author in the children's literature world, listeners are listening and you are probably likely a new author to them. So I'd love for you to take a couple of minutes and just talk about you. Tell us about you and your work and what led you to writing your debut novel.
Well, I grew up in Iowa, which is where the book is set. It's set in a fictional town called Crooked Creek, but I will let listeners in on a little secret that is actually based on my hometown, which is Cedar Rapids. I now live in Washington, D.C., and in addition to writing books, I have a day job in marketing. When I'm not working, I definitely like to stay active. You'll usually find me hanging out at the gym. But when I'm not doing that, I also do play soccer sometimes. I do like to clarify with everyone that I don't play soccer as well as Mel and Tory. So if you do see me out on the soccer field, do not expect me to be scoring as many goals as Mel.
No magic Mel for you?
No Magic Mel, unfortunately.
So what led you to writing books?
It's an interesting question because as I've been working on my some ideas for my next book and kind of just reflecting and looking back on my life as a writer, I've been reading a lot of my old journals, and I basically started journaling as soon as I learned how to write. And in those very early journals, I talk about how I want to write books and how I want to be a writer. And I started writing stories before I really even knew what they were. I was just kind of making up ideas and making characters. So I do feel like it's really been something that's been a part of my life for a very long time. Shortly after college, I started trying to pursue getting a book published, and it took many, many years and a lot of, I don't want to say failed novels, but let's just say that they live in a trunk now that maybe no one's ever going to see them. But it was always something that I continued to want to pursue, and I knew the path to publication for many people is really long and winding. But there's still something so satisfying about finishing that novel and knowing that that's something you did. And so,
Yeah.
even though Crushing It is the first one published, I really appreciate all the many years that I've spent writing and working on my craft as a writer.
So you mentioned notebooks, you mentioned journaling, and whenever an author mentions this, I have to jump in with one of my favorite reading adjacent questions to ask authors, which is, do you have a particular kind of notebook you like to write in? Because that was one of my favorite parts in Crushing It when Mel talks about her notebook. I just get excited when I hear people talking about notebooks they love. So I want to turn that question to you. Do you have a notebook that you love to write in? Are you particular about the kind or the lined paper or whatever it is for you?
Yeah, I remember growing up, there was something about that tactile feeling of which notebook you're writing in, and maybe when you're old enough and you graduate to something a little bit more fancy. It is really special. And I think there are a lot of particularities, like whether there are lines or not, that I think make a really big difference to a lot of people. When I look at my collection of notebooks for my whole life, it's really all over the place. I did have one that had a green fuzzy cover that I think might have made it into Crushing It, because I
Yeah.
remember kind of trying to weave that into the story. That was really special to me. Eventually, I just moved to writing in line notebooks because I was filling them up more quickly and it was just a spiral bound and that was easy. But now I'm kind of regretting that because having lugged these notebooks all over the place with me. I lived in Chile for a while, so, I flew them in a suitcase abroad, and then they came back to the US with me. Now they're kind of just all tangled, and it's really a big mess. At some point, I need to organize this and maybe digitize it, but it's just living under the bed for now.
I love that you've saved them all. That is the one regret I have, is that I didn't keep better track of all of those notebooks over time. I do have them now. I have many from my adult life, but I would love to go back and see what 10-year-old Stephanie was thinking about on a daily basis in my journal.
Sometimes it's really nice, but other times it is a little embarrassing. Um, just and I think this really helped me in writing Crushing It because even though you might look back and cringe a little bit at this friendship drama or the crush drama or all of these things, it does help you remember how important that was at the time. So even if now you're kind of rolling your eyes and thinking, I know the next week none of that even mattered, it's still in the end you have to have empathy for your younger self and really see how important those little things were at the time.
Yeah. And I can say as a reader who has read Crushing It that those characters are everything. They have their own quirks, they have their own challenges, their own strengths, and it is very much a real interaction between friends, whether it's the friends that are still friends or the friends that were kind of segmented apart when a friend group goes south. Like these characters are so real that I know readers are not going to find them cringy, right? Because they are going to be the kids who are in it. And I feel like they're going to find it so relatable what all of what goes on, the lots of layers of things that go on in this book. That was one thing that jumped out at me, is that readers are going to wish that these characters were real.
I really appreciate you saying that. That's definitely what I was trying to achieve. And they feel super real in my head too. So it does almost feel like I could like run into Mel, out playing soccer and we could have a conversation. They feel really vivid to me to the point where at various points while I was writing, I wanted a character to do something because that would have been really convenient for the plot or what I was trying to achieve in that scene. But I realized no, she wouldn't do that or she wouldn't say that. And I need to kind of rework this part of the book in order to be true to who this person is. I'm guessing a lot of authors listening will be able to relate to that dynamic. And something else that has been funny now that it's been out for a couple months, I do have people texting me, calling me that I grew up with or family members who knew me when I was young. And they all have their theories about, oh, this person is this person and this person, because there are some, it's not really based on my life in any way, but there are some similarities, obviously with being set in a town that's so similar to Cedar Rapids. But I sort of feel in a way that they're all just parts of me or my experiences kind of drawn out and then highly exaggerated or something else is added in. So I felt like at different points I really could relate to each character because maybe I had that same flaw or that was something that I had experienced or it was something that For example, Tori is so organized and so polished and just, not a hair out of place ever. And that is what I aspire to be, but never feel like I can. And so to be able to live that through her was actually really fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I know readers will find parts of themselves in parts of these different characters, but I know as an adult, I was going deep into my inner child. And the adult I still am today because I was also thinking, "Oh, that little bit of Mel is like me, but this little bit of Tori is like me, and I wish I was this." It just all felt so relatable. And I think that is going to be such a big appeal when readers get their hands on this. Is it's I've always said that fictional characters can feel like real life friends and real life mentors. And I think these girls can offer so much. These fictional girls can offer so much to readers, which means we have to backtrack a little bit because I've gotten ahead of myself talking about the characters and what I love about the book. But we need to tell listeners about the book. So why don't we rewind a little bit and have you tell us a little bit about what the book is about, without giving spoilers, of course, and where the inspiration came from in writing it.
Thank you for clarifying the no spoilers thing. I have been accused of by various partners and friends of being really bad at spoiling things, so I definitely will follow that rule and not spoil in this case. Um, Crushing It is a middle grade novel. It's really targeted toward that upper range of middle grade. The characters are 13, and how I am pitching it now that I've pulled together my two-sentence pitch is that it's an enemies to first crushes story about two girls on the same 8th grade soccer team with a "you've got mail" twist, and that's something that the adults here will understand, and maybe the kids won't get the "you've got mail" reference. But, as you mentioned at the top, Tori and Mel, the 2 main characters, are communicating anonymously online and kind of opening up to each other without realizing who the other one is. Meanwhile, they're working toward the championship game of their soccer team after something went really wrong in the season previously. And so it's got that sort of sports movie, sports book theme of we're all working toward the big game and what's going to happen while also having this plot line around first crushes and friendship drama and all those things that I think are very relatable to kids at these age.
You gave me a compliment in the beginning of the episode of how I talked about the book, but I can't think of a more perfect summary than you just gave. And once I realized what was happening in the book, I instantly, because You've Got Mail is one of my favorites, I thought, oh, I'm going to love this book even more because of this. So what a perfect way to capture the essence of the story. Plus, I love how you talk about the different entry points. So this is a book about soccer. This is a book about friendship. It is a book about first crushes. I'd say it's also a book about family. It's also a book about figuring out who you are and who you want to be and how you want others to show up around you was another really important part for me in this book. I think we could go in so many different directions with it. But I'd love for you to talk about how you managed to pull all of that together. The sports, the first crush, the friendship, the family, and oh, by the way, my other favorite part that we need to mention is that there are, well, two things we have to mention. It is told in the perspective of both Mel and Tory. So readers get to go back and forth and get all of that really great inside information. But then you also get, which is so appealing for a lot of readers, the actual images of their text message conversations interspersed throughout the story. And so I know I'm throwing a loaded question back at you, but I want to ask about the process of how you brought together those different storylines in such a seamless way. And was the format of the book, including those text messages that were included, was that always the case, or how did that evolution grow? to be where it is now?
To start off, I do need to shout out the team at Penguin Workshop who did such a beautiful job designing the book, from the cover to the way the emojis are rendered to they asked me all these really thoughtful questions about how we wanted the text messages to appear on the page and what would happen when it's kind of one of those scenes between the chapters. And then I even asked if we could have different handwritings, because you have a lot of Mel's poetry handwritten throughout the book, but then there are also times where Tori writes something or times where a note is left by one of the moms. And each character actually has a little handwriting font that kind of matches their vibe as well. So that was an extremely thoughtful design from the team there. And to answer your question about weaving together the different threads, when I initially wrote the early drafts of this book, it actually was all in verse. And the story was, in a strange way, essentially the same, but told in a very different way, because it all took place during the final game. And then different things happened in flashbacks that built up to a similar resolution. And I won't say more about that because we're not spoiling. But when I went on submission, I was getting a lot of feedback from editors that we really like this, we like the characters, but it's not quite working as a novel in verse. And finally, we went back to my editor now, Elizabeth at Penguin Workshop, and said, are you still interested in looking at a different version of this if it's written in prose? Because that was something that she had indicated she would be open to. And she said, yes, I'd love to. And so I went back and wrote just the beginning of the book using a more linear structure where, we start at the beginning and we just are moving our way towards the end. And, but I didn't want to lose that poetry. And there were parts of the book that I felt like really were working expressed in poems. And so that's where the subplot of Mel being a secret poet and everyone thinks she's a soccer star and everyone thinks she's just Captain Magic Mel who's only good at scoring goals and really struggles in school. But there's this element of her that she's hiding from everyone, that she's writing poems. And so then a lot of the poems that were initially just part of the novel in verse got transformed into Mel poems that were later kept in the book. And then from there, it emerged very naturally that, well, she needs to be sharing this with someone. And so what does that look like? And I explored a bunch of different ideas, and I kept coming back to this idea of the anonymous connection online, which I think, it's done so beautifully in so many different movies and stories, including, we have to shout out Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli that was made into the movie Love, Simon, which I think is just such a sweet and heartfelt book and that was so beloved by so many people. And so I got to thinking, what does it look like to have that trope used in this story? And I think having had the experience of writing the book in a totally different way and then moving towards actually having more space and more words in a prose novel to be able to weave in different plot lines enabled me to, I think, pretty efficiently introduce a lot about what was going on with their families, what was going on with their friends. And I felt like I had a lot more space to play. And then also to get really nerdy from the writer perspective, because these scenes were no longer told in flashback, they were just told in real time in the present moment of the story, they actually felt a lot more impactful. So although initially I was a little bit like, I can't believe I'm rewriting this entire book, later on I had to go to my editor and say, this was such a good idea. I'm so glad you made me do this because I love how this turned out.
Yeah, honestly, that was my first impression when you said it started as a verse book. I thought, "Oh my gosh, she had to rewrite the whole book." Of course, I'm very glad you did, but I imagine that process, probably came with a lot of mixed feelings, but I love how that is the reason that those poems are in the book and written in those different fonts, because for me, I love poetry, and so I really appreciated as a reader getting those poems firsthand. But there's just something about poetry that conveys emotion, conveys a feeling that can be hard to put into straight linear words. And I feel like all of those different poems that readers are able to read of Mel's, they signal something really important that is so central to how either one or both of the girls are feeling that they can't quite put into words until that poem arrives. And then it feels like they have more clarity around what's going on and something to think about and to hold on to. And I really think that that is the gift that poetry can provide. And I felt you did such a beautiful job putting that throughout the novel to give readers that same experience, that same feeling. You can't help but feel what Mel and Tori are feeling when you read those poems.
Yeah, because I mean, it starts with the character, Mel's character. She's not expressing this side of herself, but then she is putting it into poems, and you can see how that's creating this connection between these two girls who don't, they know they're talking to another girl at their school online, but they don't really know anything else about this person. But they're developing this bond because they're able to share a little bit of who they are. And the poems definitely play a big part in that. And then I think for Tori, who is receiving these poems and giving feedback and saying, "Wow, this is really great. This is expressing something I've felt too." Slowly, that allows her to open up a little bit too. And Tori is a much more guarded character. I think at one point, Tori calls Mel a golden retriever, and then Mel calls Tori like a prickly cactus. And I think that sort of embodies the essence of both girls in some way, at least like what they're presenting to the people at school and their friends. But the vulnerability in Mel's poems, I think, also does spur character growth on the part of Tori as well.
Yeah, and there is this really wonderful shift that does happen from the beginning to the end of the story. I would say within both of the main characters, but then filters out to the other characters in that lost friend group as well. You know, both girls are hiding in essence, or they're afraid to kind of bring out sides of themselves that people don't know. They're afraid to bring them out. They don't think that they should because I'm only good at soccer, or I'm not captain material, I'm not the writer. And they both have their own, I guess I should say, assumptions about themselves that other people believe, and they're afraid to kind of put something else out there. But what happens through the poetry, through that anonymous connection, they get braver. They start to look at things differently. And one of my favorite, I say favorite a lot because there's a lot of favorite things that I have about this book, but there is one quote that I think really embodies this important transformation in the characters and an important transformation that I think a lot of readers, including adult readers, might need for themselves. May I read a line or two from a part that really jumped out at me?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, it's towards the middle to the end. Um, and and there's a moment between the two characters, and so Mel is sitting there, and in the book it says, "I pull my notebook onto my lap. Maybe all this time I was worried about not being a words person or a natural born leader, when really what I should have been worried about is why I let people treat me like this." And I thought, oh, there it is. They're not only hiding things and they're afraid, but they're letting certain people say and act certain ways around them because of that, until that little magic moment, I'll say, for Magic Mel, who realizes, okay, maybe this isn't okay. Maybe I can be treated a different way. And that just jumped off the page at me because there's so much right now in our world, right, of how people aren't always treated the way that they should be. And knowing that's wrong starts on the inside by treating yourself better and demanding that of others as well. And so that page 115, listeners, if you have the book, that was a big moment for me. I think 13-year-old Stephanie could have used that lesson, and you're going to give that to a lot of 13-year-olds now, and that's a beautiful gift.
I really appreciate that. It's definitely something that I think is relatable for a lot of people, certainly when you're young and you're still developing that social toolkit and understanding what kind of friend you want to be and what kind of friends you want to have. But I know that's something that I've had to learn and continuously relearn at different eras of my life as well. And I think it also mirrors pretty well what's going on with Tori in the sense that she also has her own journey in figuring out how to be a better friend. Because in her world, she's a little bit on the other side of that dynamic where she does have a moment with a friend later in the story where she realizes maybe she hasn't quite been there for that person and hasn't been opening up the way she needs to. And so it was fun to have the dual narrative. It was difficult from an editorial perspective and something that I definitely found challenging in trying to balance both of their story arcs, but to be able to play with those different resonances and kind of show the different sides of things was really interesting because you realize that there really isn't any good guy or bad guy. It's not the kind of book where it has a villain character. It's more just maybe people are a little bit too caught up in their own perspective, and having the dual points of view helps you see that in a way that's, we're not really here to teach a moral or a lesson. It's the point is to have a good story, but implicit within that is this sense of like, oh, maybe the other person is seeing it from a different perspective and I should think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and all of the characters, they all are on their own journey. They all have their own different family dynamics that they are kind of grappling with as well. Um, but they are in such a wonderful way open to the feedback. And I'm putting feedback, in air quotes because sometimes it was posed as feedback and sometimes it was something said in anger, but ultimately they use it for the better and to think and to grow. And that's the transformation that I loved seeing here. I think it's worth mentioning though, oddly enough, this episode pre-recording this episode to release later, but we are actually recording it during Banned Books Week. Which feels kind of fitting because there unfortunately is a lot going on in our book world where some books are not seeing the shelves they should see. They're not getting put into kids' hands who might need to read them. And your book does have it's, a middle grade romance feels really strange to say, but it has like we said, a first crush vibe between two girls trying to figure everything out. And I know that books like this have been banned in other places. And so I want to give you the chance to talk about that. Um, what you think about that. I think it is such an important book for a lot of reasons. And unfortunately, your book may or may not, hopefully not, but may be banned in some areas. And I'd love to just get your thoughts on that in this moment.
It's always funny when this comes up with Crushing It because it feels like such an innocuous book in a way. It's very sweet. It's
Yes.
almost an escape in some senses. It's the fun soccer scenes and these young girls dealing with friendships and family and all of that. So it feels so innocent that I kind of forget that it has quote unquote content that some people find objectionable because it is a story of a first crush between two girls. And I think someone who's a little bit more removed from the conversation about book banning right now and maybe doesn't fully understand what's going on, you see what I would call the more flashy kinds of banning where you're appearing on a state list and there are these 12 books that we're removing from all the school libraries or some of the authors with who have many books out and have established audiences. You can see their books appearing on banned bookshelves and bookstores, and I think that's really good to increase visibility for those books. But it's an interesting spot to be in as a debut author where, maybe your name isn't appearing on certain lists, you're not getting national press coverage because you're being banned. You're not necessarily getting pulled to be in these curated banned book lists that a lot of people are releasing. And it's much more of this quiet, soft banning. So the book is set in Iowa, where I grew up. And in a few weeks, I'm planning a visit to Iowa to do a couple events in bookstores. And as part of that tour, we were planning to do a lot of school visits. But there is a book ban in effect in Iowa. It's still caught up in some legal in between space. And there had actually been a court injunction that the schools didn't need to enforce the ban in the meantime, but that was removed recently. And so our school visit plans and all the contacts we'd had in the schools kind of started following through, and people just said, we really like this book. This sounds like an amazing experience. How cool for someone who's actually from the area to come and speak to the kids, but we're just not sure how this is going to work, particularly because the ban it part one of th it's hard to explain. The ban is a little bit confusing, and that's one of the issues with it, but essentially, there can't be any LGBTQ plus content for students through 6th grade, which essentially affects all of middle schools because middle schools in Iowa are 6th through 8th grade. So it was really confusing and difficult for the teachers to think, how are we going to make this work when we have 6th grade students in the school? Can we somehow shield them from that? And it just becomes a really big logistical hassle, which I think is one of the ways that lawmakers write these laws in a way that it's just kind of easier to remove the books from shelves, keep them in a special area, or not buy them to begin with. So essentially, obviously, materially, this affects me as an author because it affects where my book appears and the students that I have a chance to connect with and potentially books sold. But more important than that, this was something that I was really looking forward to when I was growing up in Cedar Rapids. You are a half hour on the interstate away from the most famous MFA program, the Writers Workshop, but I felt very removed from all that. And I never met an author in real life until my mid 20s. So I was really looking forward to going and being like, hey, I went to this school. I grew up here. This book is set. You're going to recognize ice cream shops and names of schools and all these things that appear in the story. But now I'm going to miss out on that experience of connecting with kids, and also the students miss out on it. And so I think in addition to, books that are kind of getting national headlines, I know I speak for a lot of authors who are having similar experiences, and it's really frustrating, and I hope it changes.
So do I. It breaks my heart for a couple of reasons. I actually have another podcast for adults who kind of embraced reading and writing in their lives, and we spent some time talking about book banning and um, my view, which is why you need to read banned books, right? Because number one, someone doesn't want you to. And the adolescent in all of us needs to come out and say, oh, well, then that's why I need to read it. Normally, when something triggers someone because of some so-called content in the book, it usually means that's something that has a deeper level and that you need a deeper understanding of. And I feel like those triggers are actually signs that we need to dive into that in our own reading life. But the piece that really hurts me, and I'm sure hurts you and everyone can relate, is that when we ban books because of a certain content, whether that's a certain gender identity, a religious affiliation, um, whatever other reasons that people request book bans for, it's essentially a message that we're banning those people who align with those views, and that just breaks my heart to think there are kids, there are readers that won't enjoy the story because they don't know about it. And like you said, this is a fun story about soccer. It is a relatable story about broken friend groups. Oh, and it's a story about first crushes that happen to be in two girls in a very appropriate, well done way. And so it makes me really sad for you, yes, for the kids that could have had this experience that won't, but you've got a whole troop of people, a whole troop of readers and booksellers that are attempting, to get in the way of the book banning that happens. And so I'm just going to hope and cross my fingers that things change and that we can just keep talking about this book in other ways so that readers can benefit from it, whether it's feeling seen or equally as important to see a different perspective as well. So I've got so many things, so many mixed feelings. But the biggest one is that I'm so sorry that that has happened. And that just means the rest of us have to work harder so that it doesn't in the future.
I do appreciate you highlighting the bright spots as well as far as support from booksellers and librarians. I've talked to a lot of librarians who are really on the front lines of this and trying to comply with confusing legislation or just figure out where the line is as far as what they can shelve where in the library. And I really appreciate the work they're doing. I've spoken with booksellers as well, a couple of them who have either queer reading groups or are LGBTQ focused bookstores have chosen Crushing It for their monthly members books box. And so I know, there are people out there really helping these books reach readers. And then just something else I wanted to touch on that I think is interesting. I was reflecting the other day, actually, the first time I ever saw my name in print was when I was in fifth grade. And I had written a letter to the editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette against book banning. There were a couple local, I think, Catholic schools who were pulling Harry Potter off the shelves. And at the time, Harry Potter was essentially my entire life. And I really just wanted to stand up for it because I thought that was upsetting. And so there was my little name signed, Erin Becker, fifth grade student. And so it's interesting that today we're still having this conversation about trying to limit access to books and just trying to control, especially for young people, what can get into their hands. And I think that it's frustrating that this conversation is still happening and it's frustrating to be affected by it. But also, when I look at the books that were available when I was in fifth grade versus now and what's on the shelves, it really is a complete revolution in the industry as far as whose stories are told and what is available. And, I love all those books from when I was a kid, but there are just so many amazing storytellers writing middle grade right now. And I'm really excited to be a part of that. And so I think at least a bright spot in comparing it is that the industry is really doing a great job supporting all kinds of voices now.
That is a great point. And one of the things I've done, because really it takes a collective, but one person really can make a difference here, is Crushing It is now on my list, which is the list that books that I read with teachers who are in our teacher education program for children's literature. So that's one thing that I can do, is to put powerful books like that into future teachers' hands who then can continue to make choices about what goes into their students' hands. So just know that Crushing It, it's on my list. Which sounds weird to say because we've been talking about banned book lists, but it's in my my syllabus so that everyone that at least I encounter can know about the book.
That's great. Some lists are good. Some lists we are happy to be on.
Yes. So, are you working on anything that might come next? Can you give us a sneak peek into any other books that might be in your future?
I can't say anything too specific, but I am working on a book that fans of Crushing It will definitely enjoy that has a lot of similarities as far as themes and setting and is for a similar age group. So, no more specific information, but hopefully you can keep an eye out for that.
So, no spoilers for the books that are published and no spoilers yet for the ones that might be soon.
No spoilers, exactly.
Well, where can listeners find you online if they'd like to know more about you or just keep track of those books that might come in the future?
My website is erinbecker.me, and you can connect with me in several different ways there and also find out more information about my writing as well as speaking and school visits. And then I am at Becker Erin E on pretty much any social platform. Some are used more than others, but happy to connect with people there. And for finding Crushing It, you can find it at any book retailer in the US. I always have to get a shout out to your local indie. My bookstore here in DC, where I did my launch, is Politics and Prose, and I'm always encouraging people to buy from them. In Iowa, we have some great indie bookstores as well, Sidekick Books, Prairie Lights, and Next Page Books in Cedar Rapids.
Wonderful. Well, I will put links to your website, your social handles, as well as links directly to Crushing It so that listeners can easily find it and get their hands on it. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about this wonderful book today. I really enjoyed our conversation. We talked about a lot. We went in a lot of different directions, which was wonderful. I love when that happens. And I really appreciate the time you took to spend with us today.
Thanks, and really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of KidLit Love. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of KidLit Love. Thanks for listening.